Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to focus on the issue of access by independent monitoring mechanisms to combat torture, ill treatment, and other human rights violations in this, the margins of the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council. I'm Matthew Jones, working with the Human Rights House Foundation, and together with the Permanent Missions of Poland and the UK and our co-sponsoring permanent missions and NGOs, we're very grateful for your participation on what is a sensitive and challenging issue. Right at the start, I want to highlight the opportunity to raise questions via the chat box. Please feel free to take advantage of this opportunity at any stage during the meeting. In addition, this event is being streamed live via HRHF's YouTube page, and a recording will be made available there later. So you can go back to that page to find the recording. We're also aware that delegations are very busy in this, the last full week of the Human Rights Council session. And while we have a number of speakers today, we won't go over the 90-minute mark or 4:30 p.m. Geneva time. Now, many of you will be aware that the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has just published his most recent report at the 46th session. His report highlights the difficulties of cooperating with states given their responses and follow-up to official communications and country visits, and recommends appropriate measures. I definitely recommend reading that report if you haven't had the opportunity to do so already. In particular, the rapporteur reflects in his report that the majority of communications the mandate initiates does not result in full cooperation with the state in question. In particular, the special rapporteur reports that the vast majority of country visits requests either received no response or were declined over the past 4 years of the current mandate holder's tenure. Outside of the special rapporteur's report, it'll come as no surprise to anyone on the call, but the COVID-19 pandemic has presented additional challenges to international monitoring of prisons, places of detention, and territories where serious human rights violations are alleged to occur. But what are the implications for access issues in a new, largely online environment? Our panel is primed to highlight the challenges relating to access in general, but have also been reflecting on ways of overcoming some of these challenges, both with historical examples and also potentially with future creative solutions. But before introducing our strong panel, I want us first to turn to some opening remarks from our two keynote speakers, first from the Permanent Mission of Poland, and then from the Permanent Mission of the UK. So to begin, it's my pleasure to give the floor to the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Poland to the UN. Ambassador, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Ms. Matthew. And I am very pleased to welcome you all at this event that aims at raising awareness of an important aspect of preventing and combating torture, ill treatment, and other human rights violation. That is the need to ensure access by independent international monitoring mechanism to all territories and facilities where such violations and abuses are being reported. International human rights law firmly prohibits torture and other forms of ill treatment or punishment. Unfortunately, the reports presented by international organizations and their rapporteurs confirm that torture and other forms of ill treatment still occur, being used by a number of authoritarian and separatist regimes, as well as by the occupying powers. In fact, the cases of torture have been reported in countries neighboring with Poland, such as Belarus or Russia, or in separatist or occupied territories of Ukraine that remain beyond the control of the central government in Kiev. The reports of Professor Wolfgang Benedict, the OSCE Moscow Mechanism rapporteur, was one of the very first comprehensive reports to present a dire situation and massive scale of human rights violations, including torture and treatment of detained persons committed in the aftermath of last year's presidential election in Belarus. A repressive policy by Russian occupation administration in the Crimean Peninsula and city of Sevastopol, as well as horrifying practices of torture used by the self-proclaimed People's Republics in the eastern Ukraine, are yet another examples of such human rights violations where the pattern of torture and ill treatment is particularly visible. It is difficult to prevent or combat any violations that is not assessed, described, and evidence proven. And this applies also to torture and other human rights violations committed in countries or areas whose authorities do not cooperate with international mechanisms or reject to provide those mechanisms with an access to their territories. Lack of access has a negative impact on the situation of persons living in these countries or territories. Their voices are not sufficiently heard, their fundamental freedoms are more likely to be continuously denied and violated, causing thus a systematic deterioration of human rights situation. I believe that this complex matter is not always given enough space in international discourse. We should therefore intensify our calls for access by independent mechanisms, both globally and with regard to certain country situations, during debates and discussions in the human rights fora, highlighting at the same time its preventive aspect for protection of human rights, and in particular with regard to torture and ill treatment of those detained. Today's event is an example of such a call. We are very pleased to host excellent experts in international law and human rights law, as well as human rights activists. We would like to thank all distinguished panelists for accepting our invitation. It's been a big pleasure on our side to cooperate at organizing this event with our colleagues from the UK mission in Geneva and with the Human Rights House Foundation. I'm also pleased to announce the co-sponsors of this event, the Canada, Lithuania, and United States, as well as the Crimean Human Rights Group and the World Organization Against Torture. I think that this broad alliance of states and civil society organizations cooperating on today's event clearly shows the importance of this matter, of the matter that we are going to discuss, and the topicality of this issue. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we now turn immediately to the UK's Ambassador for Human Rights and Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN in Geneva. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matt. And the UK is pleased to organise this event together with Poland and the Human Rights House Foundation, and co-sponsors Lithuania, the United States, Canada, and OMCT. Torture is an abhorrent violation of human rights and human dignity. It has a devastating impact on both individuals and society. The UK works closely with like-minded partners to support torture prevention initiatives globally, including those that promote the inspection and monitoring of places of detention. We encourage the development of national preventative mechanisms provided for under international treaties. The UK has repeatedly raised concerns about human rights violations in Belarus. Despite objective and credible reports from the UN, the OSCE, and many NGOs on the use of torture by the Belarusian authorities, not a single allegation of ill treatment has been investigated. The UK urges the Belarusian authorities to cease their campaign of violence, to release those arbitrarily detained or imprisoned, and for those responsible to be brought to justice. The UK is also appalled by reports that many of the estimated 109 Ukrainian political prisoners detained in Crimea and Russia are subject to torture, ill treatment, and denial of medical care. We call on Russia to end this abysmal treatment immediately and release all Ukrainian political prisoners. Equally shocking are the horrific reports of incommunicado detention, torture, and ill treatment of detainees in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. Russia has the power to end this. International monitors must be given unhindered access. We also remain deeply concerned about the situation in Chechnya. On 10th of December, the UK sanctioned 3 individuals and an entity responsible for an ongoing torture and murder of LGBT people in Chechnya. The designations bring a measure of accountability to the officials responsible for these grave human rights violations and express our solidarity with the survivors of these violations. We urge the Russian authorities to take immediate action to stop these atrocities. We are delighted that we have an expert panel with us here today to discuss these issues in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And indeed, we'll touch on some of those specific issues during the meeting. I now turn to the first of our panelists. Professor Sir Malcolm Evans is currently Professor of Public International Law at the University of Bristol in the UK. Among a number of previous public appointments, Sir Malcolm has also chaired the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. Though he won't remember me, I first met Sir Malcolm many years ago in a meeting in Westminster in London focused on freedom of religion or belief, given his work on an advisory panel that he has served on with the OSCE. In part, this is a testament to his wide expertise on various human rights issues, and so it's a real pleasure to have him with us this afternoon. I mentioned the latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on torture in my opening comments. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur is a good example of an independent monitoring mechanism for whom the issue of access is essential. And by that, I'm particularly alluding to the mandate being able to make country visits and to have access to prisons and places of detention. The Rapporteur also has a toolbox of public and more private tools that he can employ to encourage better access and communication, as well as stronger protection measures when it comes to combating torture and ill treatment. So Malcolm, as someone who has served on the UN subcommittee and also as someone who has conducted difficult and sensitive visits to various countries over the years in different roles, I wonder whether you can provide us with a broad overview of the importance of access, including for monitoring and prevention of torture, of issues that arise when access is not possible, and possible ways of overcoming these challenges. Not a small order that you have before you. But Sir Malcolm, it's with pleasure that I give you now the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity of speaking in this important event here today. As has been said, for the last 10 years, I have been chair of the United Nations Subcommittee for Prevention of Torture. And that body has one advantage over the very many that have already been alluded here today, and that is in fact that it as a body does not need to ask for permission to visit places of detention within its 90 states parties, because that is provided automatically by the optional protocol itself. And so for all states parties, there is an automatic right of access to any place within a state party's territory where the subcommittee believes a person may be being deprived of their liberty. And so at one level, you could say access for us is not a problem. Of course, that is not the case. We cannot forget the implications of the broad-ranging nature of the mandate in the way that we go about our work, and we always have to be very careful to ensure that states and others fully understand the implications of that access, but that we use that access wisely for the purposes for which it has been granted. The work of the SBT is quite particular, and in what I'm going to say in these few minutes, I'm not suggesting that this is the way that all those involved in accessing places of detention in other countries should be acting. There is a broad range of ways of engaging, but I do want to just highlight some of the aspects of the SBT's experience that might be of value while trying to, shall we say, improve the quality of access to closed places in complex situations. The importance of doing so, I think, is unquestionable. The fundamental on which the work of the SBT is based is important, and is that we go into places of detention, our primary function is to try to ensure for those who are there afterwards. In other words, the focus of what we do is designed to be preventive, and certain implications flow from that. But what is always the case, and that we have found, is that the unchallengeable basis of what we say, because it is rooted in the first-hand experience of the committee and of committee's members, gives what they say an enhanced authority that, quite frankly, is just about impossible to rebut. When you are gaining information on second-hand accounts, even from victims and survivors themselves, it can still remain, at the end of the day, second-hand. When one is speaking to authorities on the basis of what you yourself as an individual have seen, have heard, have listened to, have felt, have smelt, it simply doesn't work for other people to tell you it's not true, because you know that it is. And that puts you as in a very different position to have conversations about how to address those situations. The basis from which you speak is immeasurably strengthened by the force of that first-hand experience. It also, however, enables you to do other things. It gives you the opportunity not only to understand what is happening and indeed how it is happening, but to have better insights into why it is happening. And it should not be taken as a given that the things that drive ill treatment and torture in places of detention are always the same. They are not. And the people who may be responsible for them may vary. Most importantly, the people who may be the persons or the institutions able to exercise authority practically to ensure that they cease may vary. And it is often only by visiting the places themselves, speaking to people and seeing the reality of the situation, that one is able to really gauge and work out who is actually in a position to effectively address the situation that one finds. But it also does something else beyond that too. It gives you the ability to think constructively about what it is actually possible to be done to address the situation. And it is one thing that certainly as when I was chair of the SPT, that I would always stress with my members, is that recommendations needed to be practical and workable in the situation to which they were being addressed. If they were going to be meaningful and have the impact that you hope they are going to have, then they had to be things that were doable and doable now, because that is what prevention, as we understood it, was about. And so those three things become some of the key hallmarks of effectively tackling torture when one has access to places of detention. The unchallengeable basis of the information that you are basing yourself on, an enhanced ability to understand the reality of what is driving what you see, and to be in better place to be able to make effective recommendations for being able to deal with it. And on the basis of that, to be able to have those often hard conversations, but necessary conversations with those with responsibility for ensuring that is the case. But it is also important, in our experience, to locate that within the particular facet of our mandate, which is that it was a preventive mandate. It was not the role, and it is not the role of the SPT to formally investigate allegations, nor is it fact-finding in the traditional sense of the word, when one is going into a place to reveal on a public stage, if you like, what has been taking place. And it's certainly not an inspection against agreed sets of standards. It is, as I described it, it is going into places of detention to understand as best one can, to identify and to come up with practical means of ameliorating or addressing or improving the situation that is found. And that we have found that this is so important to the way in which we work. Now, for many, one of the things that is the biggest challenge is that our work actually is confidential. Unless a state permits, the reports that we produce following our visits are confidential to the state themselves. Now, for many, they say, well, what sort of human rights mechanism is that? How is that shining a light on the practice that is taking place and bringing the transparency and accountability that is necessary for such serious violations of human rights? And the answer that I have to that goes back to the point I made just a few moments ago when I was in my introduction. We are one of a range of mechanisms that will engage with a state or entity concerning its fidelity to human rights. Our role, being preventive, means that it is able to work confidentially and is based upon the relationship that one is able then to build with the state's parties or those exercising authority, de facto authority or otherwise. They will know that the nature of our work is focused on trying to prevent the ill treatment that is taking place first and foremost. It is not, therefore, about bringing to public attention what we see and what we find. It is seeing what we see, finding what we find, and then working with those who are able to exercise control and authority in order to try to do what needs to be done in order to prevent or reduce the level of ill treatment that is taking place. This is not a typical role of a typical human rights body, but given that we work within a confidential envelope, it is absolutely essential that people, that states, and in those that we meet, understand what is distinctive about our work. But what we find is that if we can, and we normally are able, to build those bonds of trust between ourselves, between the authorities, and with those in detention, then we really are able to make a difference to the treatment that is being received. What we also can say is that by trying to somewhat depoliticize, de-escalate, and focus on the underlying commitment that all should be having to the prohibition of torture, and reflect that in work of the nature that I described, focused on prevention of ill treatment, then we are able to win and secure the reality of the access to places of detention, which, although we are entitled to enjoy in theory, I can assure you we would find very difficult to exercise in practice if we were not to have it. I will leave it there, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sir Malcolm, and we'll certainly look to come back to you during the question and answer session. And I suspect doable and doable now will be somewhat of a theme to some of the recommendations of colleagues as we discuss this issue further. We now turn to another quite prolific public figure on human rights issues in the wider European region in recent years. Professor Wolfgang Benedict is Professor of International Law with the University of Graz in Austria, has most recently been the OSCE Moscow Mechanism Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus, and previously held a similar OSCE mandated position with respect of the Chechen Republic in Russia. Professor Benedict, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Now, Professor, you've held these OSCE roles, looking at situations where numerous public allegations of torture and serious human rights violations were being made in relation to the territories in question, yet where access for the mandates you had proved challenging. Can you highlight difficulties for us in reporting on torture and serious human rights violations in relation to the mandates you have held, and perhaps provide us with some reflections and recommendations in helping to overcome these challenges? Also, I may add, given your Belarus-focused mandate has come during the COVID era, perhaps you can reflect a little on the issues in a world where the online space becomes ever more important. Professor Benedict, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, for this introduction. And I would like also to thank the organizers for this very interesting and important topic, which allows us to have a good exchange here today. Actually, I would like to start with the example of my recent fact-finding missions to Chechnya and Belarus under the Moscow mechanism as an example of where these issues play an important role. The Moscow mechanism of 1991 in paragraph 6 requires full cooperation from the state to be subject of the fact-finding. This includes allowing the mission to enter its territory without delay, to hold discussions and travel freely therein, to meet with officials, NGOs, and any group or person for whom it wishes to remain, to receive information, and generally to facilitate the mission in every necessary way so that it can independently exercise its function. There is also an explicit obligation to refrain from any reprisals in regard to this process against persons, organizations, institutions which were in contact with the mission or provided information to it. so much the paper, the rules. I was basing myself on this, and the first step in both missions was to write to the delegation of the respective state with OSCE to remind this obligation under the Moscow mechanism and to ask to facilitate a visit and furthermore provide detailed opinion on delegations and proposals for persons I should contact. Unfortunately, in both cases, responses received were that the country in question considers the Moscow mechanism as outdated or obsolete and therefore is not in a position to facilitate my visit. Both countries also refused to cooperate in any other way. Actually, I added my request and the answer to my report to show that I had made this effort. However, the response was not surprising, as the same attitude was already observed in the two previous cases of triggering the Moscow mechanism in such a way, namely in Turkmenistan in 2003 and Belarus in 2011. There is a certain contradiction in the fact that while, for example, the Russian Federation declares the Moscow mechanism as obsolete, it has nominated two experts only in 2020 to serve as resource persons for this very mechanism. Anyway, now let me come more to the issue of physical versus online access. There's obviously a disadvantage in not being able to do a fact-finding on the ground. However, in practice, this can be overcome by alternative, in particular online methods. And there's the possibility to draw on information also from third sides. For example, in my mission on Chechnya, I visited the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. I went to the PACE Committee on the persecution of LGBTI rights in Chechen Republic, which had a partly overlapping mandate, but also was refused access at the time. Still, they had important information which we were sharing. The only body at that time which was able to go to Chechnya was actually the CPT of the Council of Europe. But as you know, they are also under the confidentiality requirement, and the Russian Federation had not allowed their report to be published. Nonetheless, the CPT later made a public statement on the lack of progress from which one could take some important information. But more generally, what I turned to was information from international NGOs, reports from OMCT, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so on, and also from local and regional NGOs, which often produce excellent reports. Testimonials also are available from them. So there is a variety of sources, which also includes media reports, investigative journalists who produce digital material. Certainly this depends to some extent to the fact where there is a freedom of association in the country and also freedom of expression, which is a big problem both in the context of Belarus these days, for example. In addition, there is always the possibility to do interviews, either with persons who had to leave the country and which through NGOs, often as intermediaries, one might identify. So they could be met physically, either by traveling there or by bringing them to a place where they can meet with the rapporteur. But in particular in COVID times, which was characteristic for my mission to Belarus last year, it was clear that this travel option would not work sufficiently well and also not be very economical. So the question was rather to verify the wealth of information available from NGOs, media, and other sources through interviews with victims or their lawyers, witnesses, and so on, which could be organized online. And in addition, OSCE, ODIHR, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, has the practice to provide a channel of communication to the rapporteur, through which, in this case, I received more than 700 communications with attachments, with proofs, with pictures, videos, and so on. So when you bring all this together, you get quite a good overview on the situation, which in my case was also helpful because the Moscow mechanism has a restriction which is very difficult for the rapporteur, namely that you have to deliver your report within 14 days after being officially appointed, which is obviously a very short period. So when you would have to travel to that country and meet everybody, particularly also state representatives, that could also mean to spend a lot of time. And it reminds me of my first fact-finding, which was actually in the 90s to China and Tibet. And I was sitting long hours in Beijing offices where some bureaucrats read out prepared statements to me, which were of no use to my mission at all. So that means that sometimes it's also advantages. There are certain advantages time-wise if you don't have to listen to such long explanations and are totally free to concentrate on the best sources available. Certainly, it is important to then present this material also with the necessary transparency so that your methodology is open and can be checked by everybody, because in this way it will have a certain credibility. By the way, there is the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations published last year only, which has a lot of important material information on how to proceed, legal and ethical standards, guidance on visits, methodology to be used. So I can recommend that, but it's anyway known to the experts because it has been published by the Office of the High Commissioner itself. There is also an increasing possibility to get information from investigative media. As you know, when we look at digital open source investigations, this has become a new trend. Even when you look at investigative websites like Bellingcat and so on, which have produced information from the downed flight MH17 to the poisoning of Navalny and so on. So in our time, there is a lot of this, which adds up to the physical access you might have or you might not have in a particular way. It needs also to be said that there is a difference between the plausibility of the information you collect through this variety of sources and the justiciability of the violations documented. And here you need additional mechanisms, and this is what I also recommended in my report, that there is a need for an independent international body or mechanism for an in-depth investigation of these human rights violations, which handles also a kind of repository from which then material can be provided for judicial trials of different kind. And I'm very pleased to see that this recommendation has been taken up, and there will be a platform, an international accountability platform set up by specialized NGOs with the help of a few states rather soon. And also I welcome the mechanism inside the office of the High Commissioner, which is planned by the future resolution to be adopted on Belarus. So this needs to complement each other. Every investigative mission has obviously also its limits. I would like to conclude by saying sometimes it might be in the best interest of the investigated state to allow access, as it will have to defend itself anyway, either in front of the Permanent Council of OSCE or UN bodies and so on. So by refusing to cooperate, the respective country will not be able to shield off what is the situation on the ground, and even less so in a time where online communication and citizen journalists are the new standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You've mentioned a few issues for possible further discussion, and it's definitely worth reflecting on the fact that we already have some good reports and recommendations available to us through the UN system as well as externally, and we can come back to those. We're now going to take a slightly more civil society focus to our discussion, and it's really a pleasure to introduce Eugenia Andriuk, who is currently Senior Human Rights Advisor with OMCT, the World Organization Against Torture. She's previously worked with ADC Memorial and comes with a very strong understanding and working knowledge of access-related issues across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Eugenia, thank you for joining us today. We've heard from Sir Malcolm and Professor Benedict already of some of the specific challenges relating to access for international monitors. I wonder if you can provide us with a range of different approaches that have been used to increase access across the wider region, and an indication of when these might be usefully employed, a kind of a sort of a toolkit for our approach to this issue. Eugenia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you for having me here, and I'm very honored to be in such a distinguished panel. So indeed, I will provide more overview from civil society side. So first of all, for us as a civil society and human rights defenders, I would say that human rights monitoring is at the core of our activities, while also we have different types of human rights monitoring, starting from monitoring of closed institutions, but also monitoring of freedom of assemblies, trial monitorings, and general monitoring of the situation in terms of access to victims. And while for us as NGOs, both local and international, within all our types of monitor, we first of all try to document human rights violations, then report them widely, both to the authorities and to international community, but also in the same way as international mechanisms try to prevent similar violations in future. So while specifically within the region I'm working with, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as already have been mentioned, there are a number of serious challenges to access and generally to human rights monitoring in broad sense. So first of all, and it's widely known, is restrictive legislation all over the region, and in a number of contexts is civil society shrinking space. And generally, in some contexts, even a serious crackdown on civil society, where it's not possible simply to have access or to normally perform our functions. Then also a number of governments, unfortunately, as have been mentioned, do not cooperate with international human rights bodies, including Human Rights Council special procedures. Then for sure, new restrictions have been added with the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, a number of governments use COVID-19 measures as an excuse to restrict further access. And then for sure, around the region, unfortunately, we have so-called closed territories due to armed conflict, and also a number of territories having legally contested status that finally it ends that no one actually have access to the territories. So I have here drafted a diagram with some tools that we use as a civil society to get access and to get information. So if you may share the screen, Matthew or Dave, to demonstrate it. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so here I've drafted some ways how we manage to get information. So starting from the core, like access to closed institutions. So mainly in these also closed territories, it's the most difficult to get to prisons and other closed institutions. So normally it's lawyer, and it's a key figure, lawyer, independent attorneys who could have access. Very often it's on the lawyers those people who have access to detainees. And this is also what I mentioned now during COVID-19 in a number of states, government says that lawyers also are not allowed to have confidential meetings with the detainees. Then like sometimes relatives, but for me here important also to highlight that diplomats also often, especially when detainees have foreign citizenship, it's diplomat or consuls also as also few persons who could have access to people in prisons. And also in some contexts, we managed to get ombudspersons. It was interstate cooperation between ombudspersons, and they managed to have joint visits to detainees. So once again, it's like very few situations where actually like no one had access. These are few options how we managed to simply see people. Then another like context for human rights documentation is for sure trials monitoring and more broader documentation of human rights violations. And here during the last years, we have interesting tendency of so-called crowd monitoring. So I mean that these activities, which often we try to involve people who do not have specific legal background, or even some which have not been involved before in civil society activities, but they manage to perform these very simple functions, to monitor trial, what's going on. Sometimes some people also streamline everything, make videos, simple take notes, or just recording audio, and then having this information, we could provide assessment of what is going on in the country. And also now we have a number of projects which aimed at the self-documentation when victims themselves fill in some questionnaires or provide information about their cases. For example, one of such platforms that are now working on Belarus, they have managed to collect more than 5,000 testimonies of people victims of torture and other human rights violations. And it's a way how we manage to get information. For sure, with trials, it's a lot of issues with open data. Still, even in the most repressive countries, we manage to get sentences published in the websites. So thanks to analysis of open data, it's also possible somehow to track violations at least. Then for sure, huge issue with generally access to territory, simply to enter to the territory. And here we have like two huge types, I would say, of like innovative ways how to manage to get to the territory in terms of civil society. So one of the way is for famous international NGOs to travel to the countries, and often authorities are afraid to target them. Other way is on the contrary, and my colleague Vladimir will tell more about this, is when NGOs from nearby regions traveling and performing monitoring missions. Sometimes they're more easy to have access to the territory. And then for sure, what have been excellently described by Professor Benedict is online access by international mechanism, which is now also, especially in this year, but also like very much appreciated by us. So on the last point, and here my point here is reaction to human rights violations. So very often in this restrictive context, what we need is to have rapid reaction. And often we manage to have it by special rapporteurs, urgent complaints and urgent appeals, or also by early prevention mechanisms. However, and here I go to my main recommendations, having this event within Human Rights Council session is that it's important to have also robust mechanisms. So meaning that when special procedures do not have access to territory and when they got refusals, so it's important to have additional mechanisms to have so-called new generation mandates and what also have been said before, to create additional mechanisms to have inquiry commissions, to have specific instruments that could investigate and further react to the situation. So it's important also to perceive that denial to cooperate with international mechanisms is to be perceived and to be taken as a problem, as a sign that if a state refuses to cooperate, there should be more attention. There should be some consequences to those states that refuse to cooperate. There should be also some reaction by Human Rights Council, some automatic mechanisms that react to violations. Because we see when state refuses to cooperate, unfortunately, the situation tends to only to be worse. My last point here is for sure to strengthen special rapporteurs' mandates and to allow them to go beyond. If the state does not want to cooperate, still they should draft their reports based on first-hand information provided by civil society and victims of human rights violations. And finally, my last point is that in such context, the right to defend human rights and security of human rights defenders is utmost and is of high importance. So I also request and recommend to pay attention specifically to security of human rights defenders in this very complex context. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And indeed, you've touched on a number of challenges, not least that we face at the Human Rights Council in terms of standards for escalating the response in proportion to the situation on the ground. And it's something that we, continue to see the consequences of in our day-to-day work, those of us who are working at the Human Rights Council. We now turn to the last of our panelists. Volodymyr Chekrygin is project coordinator with Crimean Human Rights Group. CHRG is a human rights organization comprised of Crimean human rights defenders and journalists. It aims to promote the observance and protection of human rights in Crimea. And it's also one of the founding and member organizations of the Human Rights House Crimea. Volodymyr, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, access, particularly to prisons and detention facilities in Crimea, is an issue that your organization faces on a daily basis. De facto authorities in Crimea continue to block legal access by international monitors, not just, of course, to prison and detention facilities, but to the whole of the Crimean Peninsula. However, your organization, along with others, continues to collect and document cases of torture and other serious human rights violations in Crimea. Will you share for us a little how civil society organizations like yours are able to overcome some of these access issues, particularly in situations when more formal international mechanisms are blocked, and give us recommendations on how the international community can better support such initiatives, particularly when the kind of more formal options fail? Volodymyr, you have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, Matthew. And first of all, let me thank organizers and co-sponsors of this event for the opportunity to speak about Crimea in days of the 7th anniversary of its occupation by the Russian Federation. I represent the Crimean Human Rights Group, which is a member organization of the Human Rights House Crimea. And our work focus is monitoring human rights situation and documenting war crimes in Crimea since the beginning of the occupation. The findings could be found in our human rights situation reviews, which are published on a monthly basis. One of the main advantages of our organization is that all my colleagues and I are Crimeans who had to leave Crimea in 2014 after the occupation. We are from different cities of Crimea, so we could use our contacts accumulated over many years to attract local residents to cooperation in all parts of Crimea. During last years, all our local monitors participated regularly in training sessions on human rights, monitoring standards, and IT security on government-controlled territory. They play one of the key role in our ability to collect and to verify information on ground. They visit court hearings, peaceful assemblies, militaristic events, promoting conscription into the armed forces, participate in the monitoring of accessibility of education in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar languages, and so on. We have monitors in all main cities, but also can reach the most remote areas of the peninsula in order to interview victims of human rights violations or their relatives. We help victims on human rights violations in finding resources for legal assistance and to choose reliable lawyers. And this is the area that still requires additional financial support from international community. We pay particular attention to the cooperation with the lawyers. They are one of the main sources of documents and information of the health status of prisoners, as this is a category that can really grant access to the places of detention in Crimea. And of course, we also have our own direct contacts with some prisoners in custodial settings, but of course I can't share any details of it during an open event. But our Crimean origin is not only our strength, but also our weakness. Since the members of the team working on the mainland are well known to occupational authorities, we cannot physically go to Crimea due to the threat of being detained. At the same time, we understand that even well-trained monitors, especially when they're forced to work underground, cannot replace the presence of the experienced human rights defenders. The problem of access to the occupied territory continues to be one of the most acute. And one of the successful examples of how we as civil society could try to change the situation was the Human Rights House's mission to Crimea in 2018. The mission included 5 experienced human rights defenders from the Belarusian Human Rights House, Educational Human Rights House Chernigiv, Ukraine, and Human Rights House Azerbaijan. It was supported by Human Rights House Foundation and Czech organization People in Need. One of the purposes of the visit was to test access to the peninsula for foreign human rights defenders from both the Ukrainian and the Russian side. The visit took place in accordance with Ukrainian legislation. The group entered the peninsula from mainland Ukraine, and the non-Ukrainians taking part in mission, citizens of Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, received the necessary permits from the State Migration Service of Ukraine. The mission entered Crimea overtly, declaring the human rights purpose of the visit. The primary focus of the mission was to examine and document the situation of human rights defenders and the effects of restrictions on the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. Yet, in the course of interviews conducted by the mission, information was received concerning a wide range of other human rights violations. They include violations of the right to life, the right to a fair trial, and the right to preserve one's national identity, as well as the use of fabricated charges, torture, and ill treatment, and unacceptable conditions of detention. During 4 days, mission members spoke to more than 50 people, including victims of human rights violations and their relatives, journalists, lawyers, and civic activists. It allowed the team to document the human rights situation firsthand in a report and to film a short documentary. In the months following the mission, the key issues identified by the mission were raised regionally and internationally. The report was presented at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, at the European Parliament, the Council of Europe on high-level diplomatic briefings, and so on. The mission raised public awareness of human rights violations committed in Crimea and proved that the access to the occupied territory is possible, at least in such format. The participation of human rights defenders from other countries, not only from Ukraine, has increased confidence in the monitoring results and the findings on the report. Unfortunately, as Eugenia mentioned, now Russian Federation uses COVID-19 pandemic for additional isolation of Crimea. Those citizens of Ukraine who had to receive forcibly Russian passports now have only one-time opportunity to visit mainland Ukraine till the end of the quarantine. And those Crimeans who still didn't receive any documents of the Russian Federation will not be able to come back to their homes at all if they leave Crimea, as Russian Federation considers them foreign citizens. This has critically reduced the number of people willing to leave their occupied territory in order to be interviewed in safe conditions by human rights organization, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the Prosecutor's Office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. It also creates additional difficulties for regular trainings of the local monitors, activists, and human rights defenders. And as also Eugenia mentioned, it creates additional problems for advocates because they cannot speak confidentially with their defendants. Moreover, several Ukrainian journalists who were covering political motivated trials and violations of human rights in Crimea have received travel bans, as for example, Taras Ibrahimov, who won't be able to access Crimea for 34 years. Only few Ukrainian journalists still enter Crimea, but they have to work unofficially. And the civil journalists and activists inside Crimea are persecuted as extremists and terrorists. In these instances, the role of such missions to Crimea becomes even more important, as well as the international support for human rights organizations which are involved in documented human rights violations on a regular basis and in accordance with internationally recognized human rights monitoring principles, which have the experience of collecting evidence and are able to verify information properly. The absence of international human rights mechanism is one of the main reasons for the continuous deterioration of human rights situation, but as well as the impunity for human rights violations. As our monitoring of court decisions show, there is no practice of bringing the perpetrators of violations to account in Crimea, whether in criminal, civil, administrative, or disciplinary proceedings. They are not subject to any inquiry that might lead to their being accused, arrested, tried, and if found guilty, sentenced to appropriate penalties. The Russian occupation authorities keep on denying to investigate statements of torture, and those responsible for torture go unpunished. This in turn has the direct impact on the situation of torture and ill treatment in custodial settings. I know that a lot of states from the European Union are present today, and that's why we call to utilize the European Union and the United Kingdom's global human rights sanctions mechanisms that would allow to impose personal sanctions against individuals responsible for gross violations of human rights in Crimea. We also call on direct mentioning of certain names of the Crimean residents in official statements, as direct mentioning of victims as well as public campaigns and their support often help to stop at least torturing contributes to providing medical assistance for the victims in custody. A lot of court hearings in Crimean cases are held on the territory of the Russian Federation, in Moscow and in Rostov. We would be grateful if representatives of states could visit at least part of them, and we are ready to provide a list of such cases and dates. Probably the steps won't change the situation with the access to the occupied territory, but at least they can help now those who are still there in the gray zone for international human rights mechanism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vladimir. And I know that the report that he mentions in relation to the Human Rights Houses monitoring mission to Crimea is available on HRHF's website, if you'd like to access and read that. So that completes our lineup of panelists. We now have some time for interventions. And first of all, we're going to turn to our state co-sponsors. But before we do, I want to very quickly thank the co-sponsors of today's meeting on behalf of HRHF and the Permanent Missions of Poland and the UK, specifically Human Rights House, Crimea, and OMCT, as well as the Permanent Missions of Canada, Lithuania, and the United States. I also want to remind colleagues that you can put your questions in the chat box if you so desire. Thank you. So we'll now turn to our co-sponsors, and I'll first turn to the mission of Lithuania, followed by the United States and then Canada. If the Permanent Mission of Lithuania is with us, yes, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. Many thanks to the Human Rights House Foundation, our UK and Polish partners for organizing this very timely event. And many thanks to our distinguished panelists for sharing with us their valuable insights. Lithuania is proud to co-sponsor this event, and my sincere appreciation goes out to our other fellow co-sponsors. Torture, next to killing, is about the worst thing human beings can do to other human beings. In all circumstances and without exception, torture is a grave violation of human rights and an abominable crime. As such, it is totally unacceptable, politically, legally, or morally. That is why it is unconditionally banned by the Convention. It is all the uglier if torture is condoned or directly sanctioned by political authorities, carried out by police, military, and security forces as a matter of executing orders, and happens behind bars in places of detention against defenseless individuals, isolated, with nobody to come to their rescue from the outside, and with access being denied to independent monitoring mechanisms. We are very concerned to see it broadly practiced in our close vicinity, for example, in Belarus, in Russia, including but not limited to Chechnya, or in Russia-occupied areas of Ukraine and Georgia. At the same time, it is police and other law enforcement agencies that should play a key role in protecting all persons against torture. Hence, my question to the panelists: to what extent can education and awareness raising among members of police, military, and security forces about the absolute prohibition of torture help prevent and eliminate it? And who should take charge of such educative programs and projects if the government does not do it properly or sufficiently? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And if the Permanent Mission of the United States is there, you'll now have the floor. Wonderful. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. Really, first, huge thanks to the Permanent Missions of Poland and the UK and of course the Human Rights House Foundation for organizing the event today. We're like the Ambassador of Lithuania said, extremely pleased to join the other co-sponsors and support you in addressing this issue. Let me also join what the Ambassador of Lithuania said. It is just very clear and justified condemnation of torture. It is abhorrent that we're talking about this, and we have to all the time because it's such an ongoing problem. But I was really pleased to see that there was such a sober discussion today, and how it really demonstrates the seriousness with which the special procedures mandate holders, human rights organizations take their roles in this fight. But sadly, it underscores the lack of equal seriousness with which certain countries and regimes take the issue of access, torture, and cooperating with these important mandates. So despite torture being prohibited, the use of torture is very sadly, as I said, actively being used by oppressive regimes such as those in Russia, Belarus, and it's happening in Eastern Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. And it's why it's so vital that the UN special procedures, as well as other relevant monitors, have access to these areas to fulfill their work independently and without fear of reprisal. And we support this because the discussion is really timely, as we've seen with the High Commissioner's reports, with hundreds of allegations of torture and ill treatment in Belarus, as we've heard today with other concerns in various parts of the region. But it also comes at a time when these special procedures mandate holders are under attack, specifically under attack by the same states that we're talking about because they want to conceal and hide their misdeeds. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, and I will say it on behalf of the United States, that we are going to continue to actively defend the independence of the special procedures mandate holders, and we will continue to seek the support for the full access to the various organizations need to do their jobs and to help people in these horrible circumstances. So I just want to say a word of thanks to all of you. Thank you for the very rich and informative discussion, but also for all the hard work that you're doing to prevent torture around the world. And we'll continue to support you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll now turn to the Permanent Mission of Canada. If you're with us, Curtis, wonderful. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Canada would like to thank Poland, the UK, and Human Rights House for organizing this event. We're proud to be a co-sponsor. I'd like to also thank the panelists for the excellent presentations, and I can only echo what has been said by the missions of Lithuania and the United States. That expresses our views completely. Just to reiterate, torture is abhorrent. It's a violation of human rights, and it's never justified anywhere for any reason. And Canada would also like to join others in expressing our concerns about reports of torture in Belarus, Russia, and regions of Ukraine not under central government control. Like others and like the panelists, we just also would like to underline that access remains critical for all international mechanisms. And we continually call on these countries I just mentioned to grant full and unfettered access. To my question, the panelists noted the importance of civil society and working with civil society. So my question is when working with these stakeholders, what are some best practices in ensuring that they are not victims of reprisals? This is, I guess, also to professors and also to civil society representatives who may have direct exposure to this. Be grateful to hear more about this. Thank you.
Thank you. So we actually have quite a few questions now, both that have been put in the chat box, come through on YouTube and over email. So what I want to do, we have about just over 20 minutes left. I think I'll take the questions in two blocks. I'll read them out and we'll come to each of the panelists in the order that they first addressed us. So just to begin, we have, first of all, we've had the question around the education and awareness raising of law enforcement officials and officers, which came from Lithuania, and specifically whose responsibility is this to engage in education and awareness raising? We have just had the question coming from Canada. What are the best practices in working with civil society? And in particular, to ensure that reprisals are not carried out in any way against those who states or other stakeholders might cooperate with. We also have a question, what is the degree to which we should accommodate the needs or wishes of states, including confidentiality, in order to ensure better access? And then finally, for this round of questions, what role do embassies and delegations play inside a country? So I'll come back in order to each of the panelists. I'm not expecting you to answer all of the questions, but I give you sort of 2 or 3 minutes each to just respond to those questions you feel most appropriate from your perspective. So if we could come first of all to Sir Malcolm, I give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the very important discussion and for these very interesting questions. Briefly, the first of all, question of education. It is hugely important. Whose responsibility is it? I would say it's everybody's responsibility. It doesn't just rest in any one place. Some people still find it difficult to come to terms, I don't know why, with the idea that torture is absolutely prohibited and that there is no justification permissible under any circumstances whatsoever. It's a remarkably simple proposition, but it seems remarkably difficult for some people to understand. And the more often it is repeated from as many different quarters as possible, the better. It's certainly the responsibility of those exercising authority over detaining authorities to make sure that absolutely everyone, within their apparatus of detention is fully aware of this and held fully to account to any breaches of this. But it's also the responsibility of the international community to continue to reiterate this as frequently and as forcefully as possible. And of course, to demonstrate, solidarity by treating any allegations concerning themselves in exactly the same way as other people. Leading by example with a zero tolerance policy here is absolutely critical to underline the seriousness of the message that you're trying to get over. Because as others have said, it's one of the worst things that people can do to each other. Let's make no mistake about that. And it really needs to be dealt with. Against that background, yes, the seriousness of some states in dealing with this is obviously lacking. I'm not going to name names, given the background in which I work, but we all know that there are states who shed crocodile tears about their commitment to eradicating torture, where the most cursory look at the practice and evidence that exists shows that there isn't the slightest shred of genuine commitment to what's being said. And despite all I was saying earlier about the importance of working collaboratively with states when they want to make a difference, when they don't, I'm equally clear about the necessity of calling that out for what it is. There is a panoply of responses which are possible, and today's event, I think, has very nicely shown the full spectrum of tools that can be brought to bear. The key is knowing which tool to be used when, and finding the right one. Just to move on very briefly, confidentiality is one thing that has been raised. Yes, my committee certainly works within a confidential milieu, and there is something of a trade-off between access and confidentiality. It works for us, it would not work for everyone. It works for us because our particular mandate is to work on prevention. It would not work if your mandate was that, like a Professor, Benedict or whatever, which is of a different sort of order. For others with a more investigative mandate, an investigation that remains confidential, of course, doesn't really work in this quarter. So you must look to the purpose of the intervention when gauging, shall we say, the bounds of confidentiality here. What I would say is that where you have, for OPCAT states parties, national preventive mechanisms, there is no justification for imposing confidentiality on the work of national mechanisms. Fashions talked about. Whilst there may be different issues for the no confidentiality clause for access, I think that is clear enough. Two other things, and then I will hand over the floor. Hugely important to take the issue of reprisals very seriously indeed. It's incredibly moving to hear our civil society friends talking this program, because they know very well what the sharp-faced reality that many people doing the work that they are doing and the work that they are supporting actually face. And one wants to go as far as one can, but we've got to be very careful not to put those persons in peril through what one is doing. This isn't the place to discuss it, but taking the issue of reprisal seriously is absolutely critical to effective work in this area. Otherwise, people just will not engage with it, and they will be asked to pay a price that no one should be asked to pay. What might practically be done? Well, at a very basic level, I've obviously mentioned the OPCAT. Why don't all the states we've been talking about, some have, some haven't, ratified? Special procedures, they have a standing invitations, but we all know that, should we say, A, not all do, and secondly, it's a standing invitation to allow you to come on the terms of the state, and that's not enough. Quite why we can't have a standing invitation plus, i.e. a standing invitation coupled with the ability for the special rapporteurs to be able to decide when they wish to visit, and a common template of what is necessary for them to be able to exercise their mandate, I don't quite understand at this point. I think the time has come to address some of the difficulties, to move to, if you like, an enhanced version of the standing invitation that will facilitate the work of the special procedures, because at the moment they're being led up and down garden paths. Yes, you can visit. No, you can't. Yes, you can. No, you can't. And that's not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Benedict.
Thank you very much for the very pertinent questions. I would like to start with the issue of the protection of sources. This is indeed very important to avoid reprisals against those sources, be it individuals or be it NGOs, civil society organizations operating on the ground. Now, the question is, what is the level of confidentiality required in a certain context? And my practice is to leave it to the partner to define, so to say, this level, because they know best what kind of protection they would need. So for inquiries online, there are good possibilities nowadays to use safe channels. So technically, it is not a problem. But I realized also that some NGOs operating on the ground, they deliberately work relatively openly because they insist that this is the right to do, and they do not want to give up on their right. So they deliberately take more risk than I would recommend, so to say, from my outside view to them. But as I said, this should be left to the people on the ground to define. On the best practice to avoid reprisals, I would say that indeed one has to be extremely careful not to put anybody at risk who is sharing as a victim or in other ways, as a lawyer, for example, his or her information. And this is something which can be very delicate in particular situations. With regards to the issue of education and awareness raising, I obviously fully agree with what has been said already. I was personally a member of the Austrian Human Rights Advisory Board, which was advising the Ministry of Interior for some 10 years in this respect, and we helped creating programs of education for the police, and I have been teaching in those until recently. So this, however, requires a context in which there is a preparedness for such education. And obviously in Chechnya or in Belarus, such a situation does not exist at the moment. So my recommendations here were also to create accountability mechanisms to allow for remedies and so on, because the security forces will not take it serious if they do not risk to be put on trial or have disciplinary consequences at some stage. So unfortunately, education might not be enough. If, however, the conditions are proper, then I would say national human rights institutions should play a role in this. Ombuds institutions and so on can obviously do something. Finally, as the question also was, what is the role of delegations inside the country? In my case, this was very minimal because those states invoking the mechanism, they didn't want in any way to be involved so that I have full impartiality in what I was doing. So this was obviously an advantage, but also a disadvantage. In any case, I'm sure that such delegations can play an important role. For example, when it was about the elections, presidential elections in Belarus, there were a few delegations who together organized some kind of election monitoring. Obviously, delegations are involved in trial monitoring. For the EU, when you look at the guidelines on human rights defenders, this is even part of their role to do trial monitoring, prison visits, and so on. So delegations do have, in principle, a very important role, and I'm pleased to see that very often they are actually also playing this role. And the best, let's say, collection of steps or possibilities would actually be these human rights guidelines of the EU on human rights defenders, which, however, in my view, really need an update because they are now already dating back to 2004, 2008, and in the meantime, a lot has happened. Thank you.
Thank you. And Eugenia.
Thank you. So as for education, I totally agree with Professor Benedict that while education and training is extremely important, there is time and place for these activities. So I mean, in terms that it could not substitute accountability and investigation of torture. And from my practical experience, I think that there are, when a state or a government starts systematic reforms of police and law enforcement, I think there is a lot of space and possibilities for training. Indeed, when there is a systematic reform and when police itself is willing to have a trainings, I mean, meaningfully to improve their qualifications, but not in terms of having trainings or education in order to substitute discussion about accountability and human rights violation. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we plan these activities and when we realize them. As for protection of human rights defenders, indeed, a lot have been done for the last 10-15 years. And generally, I mean, we're very thankful for both having special mandate on human rights defenders to have specific reports on reprisals and general, like, more systematic approach also of treaty bodies to reprisals and general now support within different emergency schemes on relocation and other emergency assistance. It's indeed a lot of help like in our practical work. And here also, indeed, we have a balance between sometimes secure and more clandestine communication, and on the contrary, more public protection, because often, indeed, like more public and more open support and protection provides this additional protection. So therefore, and it's also close to the question about what embassies can do. So we normally ask embassies to support and to present during trials, try to visit people in prisons, or also to send some communication to show not only on international arena, but also to show in the countries the support both for human rights defenders themselves who are under repressions, but also for the government. And also there are always very practical issues like urgent visas for human rights defenders in danger and other possible protection, even assistance with leaving the country sometimes. And with embassies, actually, we're also very thankful. We cooperating a lot in a number of contexts. And once again, I would highlight that sometimes it's embassies who taken very actively their role in raising human rights cases within the government, like in their dialogue. And this year it was especially touching when some embassies provided basically like physical protection in Belarus for Svetlana Alexievich, for example, when ambassadors came to her flat and like physically protected her from the search. And I'm sure it's a huge, it's like their contributions that Svetlana is now in security and was not arrested actually. So I think all these cases are both symbolic, but also we see that actually like embassies could provide a lot of protection. The only here recommendations that I could have that I have seen that in some emergency situations when either the citizens of some countries like foreigners are arrested, there is no urgent reaction. So I see that sometimes reaction takes some time. And for example, like this year in Belarus, when some foreigners were arrested, some consuls were not so proactive as they should have been. So, I mean, I would recommend to once again, like elaborate and have additional training also on urgent reaction during this such human rights emergencies, which actually happening across the region. And as for confidentiality, my last point, I mean, we totally respect when there is confidentiality within the mandates, but I think it's very important to give information to relatives, to give information to close people, to families, and also in some limited scale, but also to human rights defenders, because sometimes for us it's important to understand the context. And for example, these days, like following the armed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there are still some detainees, and we know that some mechanisms have managed to visit them, but still relatives do not have any information about whereabouts of their close those ones. So I think it's important, and it's my concern always with confidentiality, that at least some limited information should be also reported, like to people working with these cases. Thank you.
Good, and Vladimir.
Eugenia almost shared all my thoughts, but of course, all of our activities with the embassies are mostly confidential, and I can't speak a lot of them, but we are very grateful for the active positions of many countries. And for example, for the short videos that United Kingdom's embassy always share the social media about the human rights violations, about the occupation. I know that it's also important and to the Crimeans, because they receive the positive feedbacks on these videos and so on, and always we receive feedbacks from Crimea when statements are made on Crimea, because people need to feel that they are not forgotten from the representatives of other world, because it's 7th anniversary, and a lot of people are feeling hopeless after this year that nothing really changes, and these statements are really important.
Thank you. We only have about 4 minutes left, which is not time for another full round of questions, unfortunately, and apologies to those who have offered some very good questions, including access to places of detention and frozen conflict regions. Moldova is mentioned in the question in the chat box. We have the role of online investigative exposure, and how does the international community engage with this sort of information when it comes to light. We have follow-up to restrictions on COVID, and ensuring that the restrictions that have come as a result of COVID don't permanently reduce possibility of access. And we have the role of other areas of the UN, other UN organizations, including the humanitarian branches and the access that they have. Unfortunately, we don't have time to come to answer all of those questions, but I want to just give back to the panelists just 30 seconds, if I might. This is really an opportunity. We have, diplomats connected to the Human Rights Council in front of us. What would be your kind of, and I hate this kind of soundbite, but your kind of 1 or 2 very key recommendations to the Human Rights Council and to delegations within the council? If I can first come to you, Sir Malcolm, just for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Perhaps inevitably I would say this to those within the Human Rights Council, but to do 2 things. First of all, to press for much greater ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And we haven't said anything about that today, unfortunately, but to enable them to work much more closely with the national preventive mechanisms which are established under that, because they do a fantastic job. And secondly, to pick up on what I said earlier about trying to enhance, if you like, the degrees of possibilities of access by special procedures by having, if you like, an enhanced standing invitation.
Good, thank you. Professor Benedict.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In my view, the most important recommendation is to maybe explain to states that providing access can also be in their interest, and is not, and that in our online world they're not able to shield off what is going on their territory anyway. And the second point would be accountability. We need stronger accountability mechanisms to prevent impunity to happen. Thank you.
Good. Eugenia.
Yeah, thank you. I will also follow up with my previous recommendations that we call for further responses and further consequences for states who do not cooperate with special procedures and with other international human rights bodies. We think that it's important to have that. And then the second is to have robust mechanisms, so meaning to have additional mechanisms for those states who do not cooperate, including accountability mechanisms that also have been mentioned before. Thank you.
And Vladimir.
Probably I'll ask to try to take the responsibility of those who are responsible for human rights relations and take efforts in this direction. And the most probably simple and realistic things that I talked about is visiting the courts in on the territory of the Russian Federation in order to support Crimean residents.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. I just want to conclude by thanking all of our keynote speakers, our panelists particularly, so Malcolm, Professor Benedict, Eugenia, and Vladimir, by thanking the missions of Poland and the UK as co-organizers and all of our co-sponsors again. Thank you for joining us. I wish you a good day and a very successful completion of the 46th session. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Best regards.